In the gentle hills of the Shire, where smoke from chimneys curled like friendly ghosts into the morning air, Frodo Baggins returned to Bag End after the long celebration. Bilbo had vanished without a word, leaving behind only a simple golden ring and a note that named Frodo as heir to the house and all its contents. The ring lay on the mantel now, catching the firelight in quiet sparks. Frodo turned it over in his palm, feeling its smooth warmth. It seemed ordinary enough, yet something about its weight lingered on his thoughts like an unfinished tale. Days passed in the usual rhythm of hobbit life. Meals were taken, letters sorted, and the garden tended with care. Still, the ring drew Frodo back again and again. He slipped it onto his finger once, just to see. Nothing happened at first. Then a strange chill crept up his arm, and the world around him grew faint, as if shadows had drawn closer. He pulled it off at once. The feeling faded, but the memory stayed. Gandalf arrived without warning one crisp evening, his tall staff tapping the door. The wizard looked older than Frodo remembered, with deeper lines around his eyes and a cloak stained by travel. They sat by the hearth, and Gandalf asked to see the ring. Frodo handed it over without hesitation. The wizard held it to the light, turning it slowly. His face grew grave.
This is no trinket from a dragon's hoard.
Gandalf said at last. His voice dropped low.
It bears the mark of the enemy, the one who forged the rings of power long ago.
He traced a faint inscription that appeared only when the gold was heated, just so. Frodo leaned in to read the words, though they made little sense to him. They spoke of ruling and binding, of shadows and darkness that waited beyond the borders of the known lands. Gandalf told the tale in measured steps. There had been a dark lord once, mighty and cruel, who poured his strength into a single ring to command all others. That lord had fallen in ancient war, yet his spirit endured, gathering strength again in the east. The ring Frodo held was the master key, and its return would draw that shadow back across the world like a tide. Bilbo had carried it for years without knowing, and now it rested with Frodo, who must decide what came next. The fire crackled between them. Frodo felt the weight of the choice settle on his shoulders. He could hide the ring, perhaps bury it deep where no one would find it again, or he could keep it close and guard the secret. Gandalf warned that neither path would be easy. The enemy already stirred, sending spies and whispers into the west. Time was short, and the road ahead would test it more than courage. Frodo closed his hand around the ring once more, feeling its familiar pull. Outside, the Shire slept under starlight, unaware of the peril that had entered its borders. He would need to choose soon, but for this night, he simply sat with the wizard and let the quiet hold them both. Gandalf nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he spoke of the dangers ahead. Frodo listened in silence, the weight of the ring heavy in his pocket, and knew the time for quiet nights had passed. Together they planned a swift departure, gathering what little they needed before dawn could betray them. The next morning brought Sam at the door, his face set with quiet determination. Merry arrived soon after, drawn by whispers of trouble in the woods. They slipped from the Shire under cover of mist, the three companions and their reluctant guide moving like shadows through familiar fields. Black riders pressed close on the roads behind them, their cries echoing like knives in the wind. Frodo felt the ring pulse with every hurried step, urging him to run faster, to hide deeper. They crossed rivers swollen by autumn rains and hid in hollows when hoofbeats thundered nearby. Sam kept a steady hand on Frodo's shoulder during the worst stretches, while Merry scouted ahead with a bravery that surprised even himself. One night, the riders drew so near that Frodo clutched the ring in panic, its cold metal burning against his skin. The pursuit lasted days, wearing them thin until the hills of Rivendell rose at last like a promise of shelter. Elrond welcomed them into the hidden valley, where ancient trees whispered secrets older than the Shire. Wounds were tended and stories shared around long tables laden with food that tasted of hope. Yet the council that followed brought no ease. Elves, dwarves, and men gathered under the open sky, their voices rising and falling as the ring lay revealed on a stone pedestal. Elrond's words carried the weight of ages. The ring must be destroyed, he declared, for no hand could wield it safely. Frodo stood when the moment came, his voice small but clear amid the great ones assembled. He would carry it, though fear clawed at his chest. Gandalf placed a hand on his shoulder, and Aragorn stepped forward with quiet resolve. Legolas and Gimli joined them, their ancient grudges set aside for this single purpose. Boromir hesitated at first, his gaze fixed on the ring, but duty pulled him into the circle as well. The fellowship formed in that hour, 9 companions bound by a quest that could shatter kingdoms or save them. They left Rivendell under pale sunlight, packs heavy with provisions, and hearts heavier still, with the road's unknown length. Trees closed around them as the valley faded behind, and the first true test of their bond lay waiting in the wilds ahead. The path wound onward from Rivendell, carrying the 9 companions through shadowed woods and over rocky passes where the wind whispered of distant storms. Days blurred into weeks as they pressed toward the Misty Mountains, their boots worn and spirits tested by rain and cold. Gandalf led with quiet determination, his staff tapping the ground like a steady heartbeat, while the others shared glances that spoke of growing trust. Aragorn scouted ahead, his eyes sharp for any sign of pursuit, and the hobbits huddled close at night, their laughter a fragile shield against the unknown. The mountains rose like jagged teeth against the sky, forcing a choice no one wanted. Snow blocked the high passes, and a sudden storm drove them lower toward the ancient dwarf gates of Moria. The door yielded with a groan under Gandalf's runes, revealing a vast darkness that swallowed their torches. Inside, the air hung thick with dust and forgotten echoes, the stone walls carved with runes that told of glory long faded. They moved single file through endless halls, the sound of their steps swallowed by the gloom. Orcs came without warning, a screeching horde spilling from side tunnels with blades flashing. The fellowship formed a tight circle, swords ringing as they cut through the attackers. Boromir's horn echoed down the corridors, rallying them, while Legolas loosed arrows into the fray with deadly precision. Gimli swung his axe in fierce arcs, shouting dwarf curses that filled the air with defiance. The battle raged through narrow passages, bodies falling amid the clash of steel and the smell of blood. Yet for every orc slain, more seemed to pour forth, driving the companions deeper into the mines. A deeper terror waited below, a shadow that stirred the very stone. The Balrog emerged from the chasm like living flame and darkness combined, its whip cracking like thunder and its roar shaking the foundations. Gandalf stood firm on the bridge, staff raised against the beast, his voice steady as he commanded the creature to turn back. Fire met magic in a blaze that lit the abyss, forcing the others to flee across the narrow span while the wizard held the line. The ground trembled under their flight, and the air grew hot with the scent of sulphur and fear. They reached the far side just as the bridge cracked, sending the Balrog tumbling into the depths with a final, echoing wail. Gandalf lingered a moment longer, his form outlined against the fire, before he too fell, lost to the chasm. The fellowship burst into the open air beyond Moria, gasping and wounded, the loss heavy in their hearts. Sunlight greeted them on the slopes, but the shadows of the mines clung to their memories, like a warning of greater perils ahead. The ring's burden felt heavier now, and the road stretched onward under a sky that offered no comfort. The companions stood weary upon the sunlit slopes beyond Moria's shattered gates, their wounds aching and hearts burdened by the darkness they had escaped. Sunlight warmed their faces, yet failed to lift the shadows that clung to every memory of the mines. They pressed onward without delay, following the path that wound eastward through rocky foothills toward the distant gleam of the river Anduin. Days of cautious travel brought them to the river's edge, where the waters flowed swift and wide under a clear sky. The company made camp among the reeds and tall grasses, their eyes scanning the far banks for any sign of pursuit. Frodo sat apart near the water, the ring heavy upon its chain, while the others tended to their gear and shared quiet words of the road ahead. Boromir stood by the fire, staring into the flames with a distant look, his thoughts turning again and again to the power that one small band of gold could wield. As evening deepened, Boromir approached Frodo with measured steps.
"The ring could save my people,"
He said, his voice low and earnest at first.
"Gondor stands alone against the shadow. With it, we might turn the tide."
Frodo shifted uneasily, sensing the change in the man's tone. The air grew tense as Boromir's words grew more urgent, his hand reaching out almost without thought.
"Give it to me. For a moment only. I would not keep it long."
Conflict fled in an instant. Boromir lunged forward, his fingers closing around Frodo's arm as desperation overtook reason. Frodo cried out and slipped the ring onto his finger, vanishing from sight amid the startled shouts of the others. Aragorn and Legolas rushed to intervene, but Boromir recoiled in shock, his face twisting with regret, even as anger lingered in his eyes. The fellowship fractured in that moment, trust splintering like dry wood under strain. Before any could speak further, the ambush struck. Orc horns blared from the trees and the riverbank, arrows hissing through the dusk like angry wasps. The company scattered in the chaos, blades flashing as they fought to regroup. Boromir roared and charged into the fray, felling foes with heavy strokes, while Merry and Pippin were driven apart toward the woods. Aragorn called for them to hold together, yet the press of enemies forced separations that no plan could mend. Sam reached Frodo's side just as the hobbit reappeared, gasping from the ring's weight, and together they fled along the river's curve. Legolas and Gimli covered their retreat with swift shots and axe swings, but the orcs pressed hard, dividing the group into isolated struggles. Boromir fought on alone against a surge of attackers, his voice echoing across the water as he sought to shield the younger ones. The river's roar swallowed the sounds of battle, leaving only echoes of the broken fellowship behind. Aragorn turned sharply from the river's edge, the echoes of Boromir's last stand still ringing in his ears. The orcs had scattered into the trees beyond the curve, dragging Merry and Pippin with them, and he knew the hunt must begin at once. Legolas and Gimli fell in beside him without a word, their weapons still bloodied from the fray. Together they plunged into the undergrowth, following the broken trail of crushed ferns and scattered orc prints that led away from the Anduin. The forest thickened as they ran, branches clawing at their cloaks. Aragorn set a relentless pace, his ranger's instincts guiding every step. Legolas moved with the silence of the woodland folk, his keen eyes catching signs invisible to others, while Gimli's sturdy legs pounded the earth behind them. They spoke little at first, saving breath for the chase, but the weight of their divided company pressed on each of them. The orcs had split into smaller bands to confuse pursuers, yet Aragorn trusted the signs of trampled ground and distant howls to keep them on the right path. Meanwhile, far to the south, Frodo and Sam crouched beside a shallow stream that wound toward the Emyn Muil. The ring weighed heavy on Frodo's neck, a constant pull toward the dark lands ahead. Gollum slithered ahead of them, his pale form twisting through the rocks like a half-starved creature of the deeps. He muttered to himself in a rasping voice, torn between promises of guidance and the old hunger that flickered in his eyes. Sam kept a wary hand near his sword, never letting the creature stray too far from sight. Gollum led them along narrow trails that avoided the main roads, his knowledge of hidden ways proving useful despite his reluctance.
"This way, nice hobbitses,"
He crooned, though the words carried a sly edge. Frodo followed with quiet determination, the burden of the quest settling deeper with each mile. Sam grumbled under his breath about the foul stench and slippery paths, yet he stayed close to his master, offering what cheer he could in low tones. The landscape grew harsher, stones giving way to jagged cliffs, and the air carried the faint chill of distant mountains. Back with the pursuers, Aragorn paused at a fork in the trail where the orc tracks diverged. He knelt to study the marks, noting how one group veered westward toward the hills. Legolas pointed to a broken arrow shaft embedded in a tree trunk, its fletching marked with the crude sigils of Isengard. They pressed onward, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows across their route. Gimli swung his axe to clear thick vines, his voice rising in a gruff complaint about their endless woods, but he never slowed. Night fell without mercy, forcing them to make a cold camp among the roots of an ancient oak. Frodo's party reached a ruined watchtower as darkness gathered. Gollum insisted they rest there, claiming safety from wandering beasts. Sam built a small fire from dry twigs, its light barely enough to ward off the gloom. Frodo stared into the flames, thoughts drifting to the friends left behind along the river. The ring whispered faint temptations, yet he resisted, focusing instead on the next step toward Mordor. Gollum curled in a corner, his large eyes gleaming as he watched them, torn between fear and the pull of his precious. Dawn brought renewed urgency to Aragorn's band. They trekked the orcs into open country, where the land rolled into grassy plains. Legolas spotted distant figures on the horizon, urging them faster. Gimli's endurance held firm despite the long strides, and Aragorn's leadership kept their spirits from faltering. They crossed a shallow ford and climbed a ridge, gaining a clearer view of the orcs' campfires ahead. The pursuit stretched into the second day, each league bringing them nearer, yet revealing the captives' dire plight through scattered signs of struggle. Sam and Frodo continued under Gollum's guidance, skirting the edges of barren hills. The creature led them through a narrow pass, complaining all the while about the sun's bite on his skin. Frodo encouraged him with careful words, seeking to keep the uneasy alliance intact. Sam offered what food they had spared, though Gollum snatched it greedily. As they descended toward a murky lowland, the first hints of Mordor's shadow appeared on the horizon, a faint veil of smoke against the sky. Their path felt lonelier with every step, yet the bond between the two hobbits strengthened amid the desolation. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli closed the distance at last, cresting a hill to see the orcs herding their prisoners into a wooded vale. They struck swiftly from above, arrows and axe blows scattering the guards. Merry and Pippin escaped into the brush during the chaos, but the orcs regrouped quickly. The three companions fought on, their separate skills weaving into a fierce defense. By midday they had driven the enemy back, though the trail of the hobbits now split once more amid the trees. Frodo and Sam reached the edge of a foul marsh as the sun began to set. Gollum pointed ahead with a trembling finger, promising a safer route through the reeds. The air grew thick with mist and the distant rumble of thunder from the east. They pressed forward together, each step carrying them deeper into the unknown lands that lay between them and their grim destination. The marsh stretched before them like a black wound in the land, its waters thick with decay and the stench of things long dead. Frodo and Sam followed Gollum's crooked path through the reeds, their boots sinking with every step. The sun slipped lower, painting the mist in shades of blood and ash. Thunder rolled from the east, but no rain came, only a dry wind that carried the faint clash of steel and the cries of distant armies. They pressed on in silence, each breath harder than the last, the weight of the ring growing heavier on Frodo's neck. Mount Doom loomed ahead, its slopes black and cracked, smoke pouring from the summit in a steady stream. The ground trembled underfoot, as if the mountain itself fought against their approach. Gollum darted ahead, his eyes gleaming with a feverish light, urging them forward with whispers that faded into the fog. Sam kept close to Frodo, his hand steady on his friend's arm, while the sounds of war grew louder behind them. Across the plains, the forces of Gondor and Rohan clashed with the endless hordes of Mordor, swords ringing and horns blaring in a desperate bid to draw the enemy's eye. Frodo stumbled once, the ring pulling at his thoughts like a living thing. Visions of power flickered in his mind, but Sam's voice cut through them, steady and true. They reached the base of the mountain as night fell, the air hot and foul with sulphur. Gollum led them up a narrow trail of jagged rock, past pools of bubbling lava that cast eerie shadows. The battles raged on below, arrows flying and great beasts roaring, but here on the slope, the world narrowed to the path ahead and the fire that waited at its end. They climbed higher, the heat intensifying with every turn. Frodo's strength ebbed, yet he forced one foot in front of the other, the ring burning against his skin. Sam carried much of his burden now, half dragging him along when the path grew steep. Gollum scuttled in front, muttering to himself about the precious thing and the fire that would claim it. From far below came the roar of a great army breaking through enemy lines, but the three companions heard little of it, their world reduced to the mountain's throat. At last they stood before the crack of doom, the fiery chasm where the ring had been forged. Lava surged below in waves of orange and red, throwing heat that seared their faces. Frodo paused at the edge, the ring heavy in his hand, after he had slipped it free. Gollum lunged then, his fingers clawing for the prize, but Sam shoved him back with a cry. The struggle was brief and fierce, bodies twisting near the drop. In the end, Frodo stood alone at the brink, the gold band trembling in his grasp as the mountain shook around them. He cast the ring into the flames. It fell with a scream that echoed through the depths, vanishing into the molten heart of the world. A great wind rose from the chasm, carrying with it the shattering of Sauron's will. Across Middle-earth, the dark towers crumbled, the armies of shadow faltered and fled, and light broke through the endless clouds. Frodo collapsed into Sam's arms as the ground heaved, the victory won at the cost of all their strength. The mountain rumbled one final time, then grew still, its fire spent and its terror ended.